I guess we can get started. So if nobody minds, since there's room at the front, I am going to teach with my mask off. That is the one time I'm able to take it off, is if there's room. But I did one of my lectures today, and I talked for an hour with students right up against it, so it's a little bit harder to enunciate with the mask. But welcome to PSY 104G. If you were a little bit earlier, you might have heard the end of 104F. I do the same classes back to back in this room, so if ever you kind of hear some stuff, it might be easy to think that you've missed your class or something like that. It's just that I do two back to back in the same place. So, just so you know. All right, so I'm going to get started by just introducing myself, why I'm standing here in front of you, and who I am to be teaching you for this semester. When I was an undergrad, I didn't necessarily understand this part of every semester, where your instructor stands up at the front of the room and sort of tells you what they've done. But I've started to realize that it's more of a giving you my credentials so that you know who I am, what my background is, so that you know that I have the qualifications to be giving you the information that I'm giving you. And that's pretty relevant in this class because I spend a lot of time talking about critically thinking and evaluating where information comes from. So when you're reading a paper or you see a headline in a newspaper, hopefully I'll get you to start thinking about, well, where is that information coming from? Is that a valid claim? Some of that sort of stuff. And so this is me starting right at day one with, these are my credentials and these are why I'm qualified to teach psychology. So my name is Dr. Kimberly Campbell. You can call me Dr. Campbell, you can call me Kimberly. Either are acceptable. Despite the whole talk about why I'm qualified to teach you psychology, my background actually started out in not psychology. I started in physics, realized I was really bad with numbers, switched over to biology, and then did a 5-year undergrad degree at Dalhousie University, focusing on genetics and evolution. So I'll talk a little bit about my research in the lab for that. But then I moved on and took a very drastic swing and started studying psychology at the University of Alberta. And that's where I got my master's and my PhD. And now, instead of studying single-celled organisms, I study how birds learn and communicate. So pretty dramatic difference there. I also like to talk a little bit about me as a person, so I'm not just a faceless academic who stands at the front of the room. I found this especially helpful with online learning because when you're just a disembodied voice talking over slides, people kind of forget that you're a person. And I liked it because it doesn't have to be super formal all the time. So I am definitely a bird lover. I study birds. I have 2 birds of my own. I try as much as possible not to give just bird examples, but it's pretty bird heavy. I love chocolate. I do photography as an outlet for creative energies because it's a lot easier to take a picture than to draw one. I play a lot of Pokemon and have since I was very, very young. And when I have time, I like to collect hobbies. So I try new stuff out and then get bored of it fairly quickly and move on to something else. So sewing, crochet, knitting, sculpting, painting, I've tried quite a few hobbies, and I'm sure I will try more in the future. I feel like I should have reversed these slides. I talked about being a bird fanatic. I always introduce my research assistants because A, it's a nice excuse to introduce pictures of cool birds. But when I was doing online lectures, it was really important to give people a heads up because I have 2 birds at home. They make themselves known. So if ever I have to record something like an announcement or a clarification and I do it in my home office, these 2 usually make themselves known. I have filters to remove some of that, but if you've ever met a sun conure, the yellow one, they can hit like 90 decibels on a good day, so there's only so much a filter can do. That was something I wish I had known before bringing her into an apartment, but they're good. They're good and vocal during the day, but nice and quiet at night. So back to research and a little bit more of that credential stuff. I'm going to talk about my experience and the stuff that I've done hands-on that allows me to teach and talk about some of this stuff in psychology as an expert. So I mentioned my undergraduate research. I did biology. I sequenced DNA that was taken from soil samples to try and identify the single-celled organisms that lived in that soil. So that was my fancy way of saying that we drove to the beach and we collected dirt and brought it back to the lab and extracted the DNA of all of the organisms in that dirt. And it was just as glorious as you would imagine. You'd show up at low tide, you'd get the grossest patch of dirt you could find, and you'd bring it back to the lab. But it was really interesting because I got to, as an undergraduate, design and run my own PCR experiments. I learned how to clone, where I made extra copies of the genes we were interested in so that we could then send them off to get sequenced. Because at the time, the university didn't have their own sequencing machine. That's something that's only recently become affordable for most institutions. So we sent ours to Quebec to be sequenced and actually found a couple of new species that we had never seen before. So even though it's a very niche thing, it was a good experience. And as I said, I completely pivoted and started studying learning and communication in black-capped chickadees. So I'll give you guys a little bit of a crash course on how we do that when we get into the chapter on learning. And that's because a lot of the studies that we do involve things like operant conditioning, where we get to see how the birds behave in response to different sounds, and we can teach them that different categories of sounds should be treated a certain way, and then we can present them with new sounds to see if they put those new sounds in their existing categories. And it'll make a lot more sense when we've done the learning chapter because we'll talk about things like that. But it's nice to have like a real, actual practical application for it, and I can even show you some of the data from the lab, which is really cool. All right, and so the last bit about me is a little bit about my teaching philosophy. So the first thing that I always point out is my slides are very boring. They're plain, black and white, high contrast. And that isn't just laziness, that's also intentional. Early on in my career, I had a couple of students who had visual problems where they had trouble seeing anything that was low contrast. And it occurred to me that I could just make all of my figures, all of my slides, high contrast so that they'd be more accessible. If this is something that you've ever considered, you might realize that most textbook figures are awful for contrast. So I redo a lot of figures so they're a little bit easier to see. So yeah, it comes across as boring, but it's kind of intentional, and that's why. So now you know why. And in that same vein of trying to make changes and make things as best as they can be for the students that I have, I'm always looking for ways to improve my courses. So if it occurs to you that it might be neat if we did a particular thing or talked about something or presented things a certain way, don't hesitate to let me know. Send me an email. Come up after class. I love talking about random ideas. That's one of the best parts of the in-person, because I've had students who come up and ask questions, and I'll say, I don't know, but let me look it up. And in the start of the next class, we'll do a 5-minute aside where we talk about whatever I found. So that kind of stuff is great, and I like that interaction. So don't ever hesitate to come up to me. And then the last point here is actually for you guys, where I want you to try and make use of as many resources that are available as possible. So I like including videos and extra links, not because they are specifically testable, but because I think that having multiple ways of looking at the same information to be helpful in learning that information. So you'll find that I include a lot of links in my slides, or I'll share a bunch of videos on our Moodle course page. Those are all just extra stuff. I won't test you about them specifically unless I tell you they're specifically testable. I don't think I have any planned that are specifically testable, but it's just extra stuff that can help you understand concepts and make it a little bit easier to figure stuff out. I'm also big on asking for help if you need it. So as I said, you can come up to me after class if you have questions. If you're comfortable putting up your hand in class, you can put your hand up in class. You can send me an email. You can email me and we can set up a Zoom conversation, whatever works for you. I would like to be accessible so that you're comfortable asking questions and having conversations, because especially with courses and having multiple courses, things can spiral out of control quickly if you don't understand something and we build on it. So as soon as you have questions, just ask. All right. And that brings us to the first of what will be many sort of tangents that I like to introduce. And these tangents I like to announce because they're non-testable, but they are either useful or interesting. This one is more on the useful side, but maybe you'll find it interesting. And this is because this is stuff that I wish I had been told as an undergraduate, because I had no idea how to interact with academics. I had no idea how to talk to instructors. I had no idea how to send emails, none of it. So I include just a little bit of info to give you that insight when we get started. So when you're trying to contact an academic, maybe it's an email or maybe it's a face-to-face introduction, you don't necessarily know what to call them. Do you call them instructor? Do you call them doctor? Do you call them professor? Mr., Mrs.? What terms do you use? And there are technically right and wrong ways to do it. And nobody tells you these things, which is the whole purpose of this. But the reasoning behind some of this stuff is you can call someone doctor if they have a PhD or an MD. So my experience is all on the PhD side pretty much. But if somebody has that degree and they list it behind their name, it's safe to call them doctor. Professor is actually someone's job title. So a professor is usually also a doctor, so you can use both of those. At least in North America, different places have different conventions, but their job title is professor. And then our third option is instructor, and that's someone who isn't a professor but is teaching a course. And there's no specification there of them having to have a PhD. So I did a visual because the words didn't necessarily make all that much sense to me. But I have the little purple dot in the middle, which is me, and I am a doctor because I have my PhD. But you can also call me instructor. That's my job title because I am technically I'm a sessional lecturer, but instructor works too. I am not, however, a professor. That's not in my job title, so I don't fit that bubble. And for another example of maybe how you could look this up if you were trying to talk to somebody, I always use my graduate studies supervisor because I just think it's funny, and I had his kids in my class one year, so putting their dad up on the screen just made me smile. So this is Christopher Sturdy. I have circled the fact that he has a PhD, so we could call him Dr. Sturdy. That would be acceptable. His job title is also a professor of science, so we could call him Professor Sturdy. That would be okay too. And then I do always say that sort of formal title is good for a first contact with somebody. If you're not sure how to address them, go with their formal titles, and then look at how they respond to your email. So for me, if somebody reaches out and they say, "Hey, Dr. Campbell, question." When I respond, I'll usually sign with just my first name. And that's me saying that that title was acceptable, but you're fine to call me by my first name. So if you email someone and they respond, whatever they respond as is usually them saying, "This is what I'm okay with being called." And another trick that nobody had told me until it just sort of clicked one day. So that's a great way to see it. And sometimes those sign-offs can be used to gently correct a miscommunication. So if somebody had emailed me and said, "Hey, Miss Campbell, question," I might sign back saying Dr. Campbell because that's the right title. In academia, some people get really hung up on stuff like that. Clearly, I've told you you can call me Kimberly, so I don't care all that much, but it's just something good to know, and it helps you feel like you're not starting sort of on a back foot when you get into these conversations with academics. So that's my little mini lecture within a lecture of potentially useful information. All right, and that brings us to the last part of our intro slides, which are actually getting into stuff for the course. And this is going to transition us to our Moodle site and our syllabus. For people who have taken courses at Concordia before, a lot of this info is going to be repetitive and stuff that you already know. So you can zone out for a little while if you want. But for everybody else, this might be your first class. So I give as much info as I think is necessary. So Moodle is going to be one of the most important sites for this course. Moodle is central to pretty much all of the courses on campus, and you'll have a Moodle site specifically for this course. And that's where you're going to be able to find all of the information that is pertinent to this course. So you'll find general information, things like our syllabus, our announcements. So if I have to get information to the whole class all at once, I'll put out an announcement on Moodle. I'll also talk about things in class, but it's good to have it written down. I'll have that way of communicating with everyone. I also include frequently asked questions, which is basically my way of saying if people are asking the same questions, like if two people ask the exact same question, that tells me that I wasn't very clear with that information, or maybe something needs a little bit more expanding. And so I can use Moodle as a place to give that information not just to the people that asked, but to everyone. Because I find if like one or two people have asked, more people are thinking about it but just haven't reached out. So I'll post information like that as much as possible. On Moodle, you'll also be able to find a bunch of resources for our course assessments. So that's where you're going to go to find our chapter quizzes. That's where I'll give you some of the details on our midterms, our final exam. And that's where I will eventually post information about our written assignment. So it's a really good resource for stuff like that. And then on the day-to-day stuff, that's where I'm going to put recordings of the lecture and the lecture slides so that you have access to it. So the lecture slides are going to go up as far in advance of us covering a topic as I can. So we're going to start touching on Chapter 1 today, so the Chapter 1 slides went up this morning. I will post the Chapter 2 slides sometime in advance of next week so that you have some time to look at those or download them or whatever before you come to class and we talk about them. For the lecture recordings, that's what this whole setup is. I've been recording my lectures for online for 18 months, and it occurred to me that it's really easy to just bring that setup here so that if you have to miss a class or if you're not comfortable being in class for whatever reason, you are more than welcome to stay home and you get the exact same content. So I'm capturing my screen, I'm capturing my voice, everything will be accessible to you. So that information is something you can get later. And even if you do come to class, it's a great resource because you can go back and re-listen to the lectures if you wanted to. So lots of options. I find that quite useful. So what I'm going to do is actually hop over to our Moodle page. And I give the disclaimer that this is the instructor version. I don't have any access to make it look like the student version, so there might be extra buttons that you don't have, but the layout's going to be pretty much the same. So each course has their own page, so this is ours. At the top, I just put some general information. So this is my email address. If you click on that, it'll make you a little email window. When you're sending an email, make sure that you include the course code in that subject line. I mentioned that I do the exact same class in a different section right before this. So it's really easy to mix up classes if you don't tell me which section you're in. So if you're asking questions, especially about, say, when a test is or something like that, it does differ between classes. So just try and remember to tell me which section you're in. As promised, you can find the course syllabus here. It should be the final version. If I have to make any changes, I'll sort of make a note and let you guys know that I've changed it, but that should be everything in stone other than, say, typos. I always seem to find a couple of little weird typos after I've posted them. For the content itself, I have recently learned that you can collapse topics so that you don't have to scroll forever by the end of the semester. because I've had classes where there's, say, 30 different sections. So if you collapse them like this, you can get to the bottom in no time at all. And so I've set it up here where these are the first of our frequently asked questions. That was just stuff for getting started in the course. I'm going to cover most of this in way more detail throughout today's class, or have already covered some of this stuff. But that's just what I thought was important to get out to you guys before the class started. I also include like the textbook information. There's also these really neat little tick boxes at the side here. And I had a student last semester who actually told me those existed, and they allow you to track your own completion of topics. So if you've done a quiz or you've downloaded the slides, you can tick that box as a visual cue to yourself that you've already done something. I find that really helpful. So everything that I post on eClass has a little tick beside it. You can choose to use it or not. It's just sort of useful, but I thought they were kind of cool. This is where you're going to find our chapter quizzes, which I'll talk about when I get into our syllabus. And you might have already found our slides. So I break everything down by the week. So when we get into our syllabus, we have a list of topics, what we're going to talk about each week. I'll post the relevant slides for the first time under the first week that we talk about it. So if we talk about, say, chapter 2 is going to be weeks 2 and 3, I'll put them in week 2, but I won't post them again in week 3 because that's just redundant. So they'll be in the spot where they are relevant. And so here we have the day 1 slides, which is what I started with, and then the chapter 1 slides, which is what I will move on to when we have time at the end. Okay, so that brings us to the syllabus. And again, if you have read a syllabus, then you can kind of just focus on like the high points that I'm going to hit right now. If you've never actually read through a syllabus, I'd recommend doing it at least once, because these documents, while long and fairly dry, they include a lot of useful information. So this is a great place to find things like important dates, or who to email if something happens, or things like that. So there's lots of links and phone numbers and contact info for different situations. So the syllabus is a great place to start. But I'm going to scroll through it fairly quickly because they all have the same basic template, but I will point out the stuff that I think is most important. So for the start off, the most important thing, in my opinion, is our table of lecture topics. And that's because this includes not just what we're covering each week, but it also includes things like holidays and important dates. So we see that next week on September 6th, it's Labor Day, so there's no classes. And that's really important because I have absolutely shown up on days when the universities are closed, which is not great to do. So don't come to class on the 6th because we won't be allowed in. It also gives us our midterm. So our first midterm is on September 27th. And it tells you that midterm 1 is going to cover chapters 1 to 3. So you can go through this and see what we're covering, when we're covering it, when it's tested, due dates and stuff like that, all in one nice place. So what I typically do at the start of a year is I'll print out this page of the syllabus for each of my classes, and I'll tape it to the wall so that I can actually see what's going on in each class so I know when stuff's coming up. You might use, say, Google Calendars or have a written agenda or something like that. It's a really great spot to start and note when things are due, when you have tests, that sort of stuff. All right, so from that, we can actually talk about each of our individual assessments. So I kind of started talking about midterms. So we're going to have 2 midterms in this class. Each is worth 25%. That first one is on September 27th. The second one is on November 1st. So if I scroll back up here, you can see those highlighted. And you'll notice that the midterms aren't cumulative, which means that the first midterm covers chapters 1, 2, and 3, and the second midterm covers chapters 4, 5, and 6. There's no overlap in the content there. So you don't have to remember the stuff from earlier for that second test. Though you will need to know everything come the final exam. When the final exam happens, it is cumulative, but I bias it towards more of the new content. So we're going to cover chapters 7 and 8 after the second midterm. So our final exam is going to be 60 or 70% of questions on chapters 7 and 8, but then the remainder will be stuff from the earlier chapters. So you can expect to see, say, 2 to 5 questions from each of the previous chapters, just volume-wise. And I'll give you a more precise breakdown of that as that becomes relevant, and, as I think about actually writing the exams. For the content of my midterms, I do a mixture of multiple choice and short answer question. So I'm going to get you to do some thinking, get me some opinion questions. With my short answer questions, there isn't necessarily a right answer. Sometimes I'm just looking for you to have an opinion and give a little bit of evidence. Those aren't meant to be like, when I say short answer, I don't mean like lines, I mean like one sentence, maybe 2, depending on how many marks I give you. But I'll, again, give you more detail of that as it becomes relevant. The other really important thing about our tests is that everything in this course is open book. So my intention is for you guys to be able to have your notes or make a cheat sheet or have your textbook in the class if you need it. So the way that I ask my questions is I don't get you to memorize things. I'm not on an exam going to ask you, what's the name of the person who pioneered psychotherapy? That's something you can look up, and that's not necessarily helpful in determining if this course has taught you anything. So what I would ask instead is, okay, so Freud pioneered psychotherapy. If somebody was going to use his views in this situation, what would that look like? So I'm going to get you to apply some of the concepts that we talk about in class. So you won't have to memorize things like names and dates, but you'll have to apply concepts and start thinking about how things work together. So that's why I have stuff open book. I started doing it with online courses because I didn't like proctoring stuff. And then it kind of became, this makes way more sense and they're better questions to ask. So that's why that is. And so the midterms and the final exam will all be open book. So if you want to make yourself a cheat sheet of concepts or definitions or whatever, you are welcome to do so. The other types of questions that I ask are going to be on our chapter quizzes. So if our midterms and final are going to be on application questions, our chapter quizzes are going to serve a different role. They're still going to be open book, but the chapter quizzes are more meant to be sure that you're keeping up with content as time goes on. So there will be some memorization type questions, some check your understanding type questions, and then a little bit of some of the application questions like you might see on the finals. But they're more meant to be done as you work through the textbook or done as you go through your notes or listen to the lectures or whatever. And I've set everything up, or I will be setting everything up on Moodle so that as we cover a topic in class, I'll open up that quiz for you. So starting tonight and or tomorrow, I'll post the chapter 1 quiz. And that's going to be available to you from now up until our first midterm. And that's because the first midterm is where we're testing chapter 1 content. So you have as much time as you need between now and then to work through those questions. So you can log in on Moodle, you can open it up, look at your questions, close it, you can meet with people, you can chat about it, whatever you need to do. No time limit, no nothing. The only time it's going to auto-submit on you is when the deadline comes up. So if you forget to submit before the deadline, no big deal. It'll save where it is and submit for the deadline. But that's just to give you guys some flexibility. I have ideally you would do sort of 1 chapter quiz a week-ish. But I know that life is hectic and you have other classes, and I want to give you as much flexibility as possible. So that's why the sort of rolling due date there. And so like the first first quiz is going to come out this week. The second quiz will come out next week, and that'll be open all the way up to the midterm, the first midterm. The third quiz will come out whenever we start Chapter 3 and be open till that first midterm as well. So you can start them whenever you want. You can do them all at once right before the midterm, whatever works for you. Okay, so that is midterms, chapter quizzes. Our last thing is our written assignment. Now, I don't do a ton of information on the written assignment specifically because I don't introduce it until after the first midterm. And I do this for a couple of reasons. The first is there's a lot of moving parts in this class. There's chapter quizzes and midterms and all of that stuff. And you have other classes. And at the beginning of the semester, things are busy. So I like to give you a chance to get settled, get comfortable before I introduce the written assignment. That being said, not telling people about something tends to make them anxious about it. So I will give you enough information so you know you don't have to worry about it. So for the written assignment, which is due mid-November, and I'll introduce it at the beginning of October, I'm basically going to get you to read a scientific article and write a 2-page double-space summary and critical evaluation of that article. So I'll give you more details about the specifics of that, but I'm trying to let you know that it isn't meant to be sort of a massive project. It's 2 pages double-spaced, so it's like 800 words or something like that. It's not a long thing. So it's just meant to be that you're showing me that you can critically think about a topic and get your point across. That's all it's meant to be. I've had some students, once you've read your article, writing up the paper part can take as little as an hour or 2. So it's not meant to be, multiple sleepless nights or anything like that. So don't worry too much about it. All right, so that's midterms, written assignment, chapter, quizzes, and final. All right. The course policy stuff. I've already touched on announcements, I think, just in case. I use the Moodle announcements if I have to get info out to everybody. You can manually check the Moodle announcements by clicking the announcement button, but as students enrolled in this course, if I post anything in the announcements, you should also get an email with that announcement in it. So you don't have to specifically check the announcements, just check your email sort of once a day. If anything's super important, I'll post it there. So if I have to cancel a class for some dire reason, I would send out an announcement. For my email policy, I already mentioned that you should include the course code in your subject line, but I also specify that if at all possible, when you send me an email, try and give me more than a statement like, I don't understand behaviorism. If you can give me a statement like, in class, we talked about behaviorism and I understand it to be like this, but I don't understand how to apply it to this situation, that gives me a little bit more of an indication of what you're actually stuck on. So if you can tell me what you do know and then where specifically you're stuck, I can give you a more useful response. So that's what my email policy is intending to state. Is if you can tell me more about what you don't get, I can give you a better response. All right, and we can skip most of this stuff. The next, I think it's the last really important part, is what happens if you miss work or exams. So there's a couple of different situations and each has their own special considerations. So I'm going to summarize a couple of paragraphs here as concisely as possible. So if you have to miss a midterm, the official thing is that you have to let me know within 24 hours. With any kind of deadline that you have to miss, let me know as soon as you can. The earlier I know, the better, and the easier it is to find some kind of arrangement. With the midterms, the sort of cutoff is 24 hours. I also let people know that I've had students who, for one reason or another, physically couldn't contact me for multiple days. That's extenuating circumstances will make it work. But if at all possible, within 24 hours. If you miss a midterm, I don't do midterm rewrites. It's really difficult to find another time and a place to have a writing, and then I'd have to write a new midterm exam for you to take. So what we do instead is we defer or transfer the weight of the missed midterm to the final exam. And that's because the final exam covers all topics in the course. So instead of testing you on chapters 1, 2, and 3 in midterm 1, we're going to use your knowledge from the final exam and the topics in chapters 1, 2, and 3 there. So if you need to miss a midterm, we just move the weight. For chapter quizzes or the written assignment or something like that, same thing. Give me as much warning as possible if you need to miss a deadline. For those, I can usually adjust a deadline. So something has happened, maybe you need 24 hours or 48 hours or whatever. Let me know, again, as far in advance as possible. We'll come to an arrangement. For the final exam, if you have to miss the final exam, that's something that is sort of covered at the university level. So everything except the final exam, I make the call, I decide how we're handling it. With the final exam, I believe that has to go through the dean's office where they have to approve a deferral of the final. So you just have to show that it was missed for a legitimate reason, and then I'll set up an alternate time and write a new exam for you to write at that time. So there is a way to handle all of these things, and the specifics for it, as well as which specific sections you can go to if you ever need this info, is all in the syllabus. And I think that's everything I specifically wanted to cover. As I said, with the syllabus, if you haven't read one from beginning to end, I recommend doing it at least once so that you know what's here if you need to look for it. But otherwise, I've covered what should be most important for us in this class. Before I move on to actual content, does anyone have questions about this sort of stuff? No? Not yet. All right. Then I will hop on over to chapter 1. Yep.
Sorry, I just saw on the syllabus it said like office hours are virtual. Do you have any like in school office hours at all?
No, just like if you have a question in class, you can come up to me after class. I do try and end just a little bit early so you have time to move between classes. But otherwise, I don't actually have an office because they're building a new site. But yeah, just send me an email and say, hey, I'm available Wednesday afternoons, and I can make up a Zoom for you.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just have a question about the textbook.
Sure.
Is it like required to have the textbook? Because I didn't see it on the book list when I was ordering.
Yeah, so you can't, if you want the textbook, you can't get it through the bookstore. You'd have to order it. There's a couple of links on Moodle as well as in the syllabus. It's listed as a recommended textbook, which means that you should be able to do fine in the course without it. Some people really like textbooks and do well with them. So if that's the case, I base my lectures out of the textbook. And I will also be basing my tests from the textbook content. And the way I explain it is I choose to teach what I think is most important, and I also test on what I think is most important. So there's a lot of overlap between what I teach and what I test, but I never say that I will teach absolutely everything because sometimes things slip through the cracks. So there might be a couple of little things that are in the textbook, but not in lecture that can be testable. But for the most part, I'm going to hit all the high points as I lecture.
Would you suggest getting the textbook?
If you're the kind of person that will read it. Yeah, always that caveat, because I was the student that always bought textbooks and then never read them. And that's because I didn't learn how to read a textbook until grad school. Now that I've figured it out, I read all my textbooks. But you have to know it a lot better to teach it than you do to take a class. So yeah, it's one of those I tell people, especially where I think you can only get an e-version of the textbook. Maybe give it a week and see if my way of teaching lines up with your way of learning. And if so, then maybe you don't need the textbook, but if you want that extra information, if you want more to it, then you can pick up the textbook. Cool. Awesome. All right, so then we're going to start with chapter 1, which is creatively called The Evolution of Psychology. And another thing, when I was a student taking undergrad courses, I always hated that we started with the history of a topic. until I realized why we start with the history of a topic. And that's because where the field has come from gives you some information on where the field is now. So why do we talk about things the way that we do? Well, it's because of where we came from. So we're going to talk about quite a bit of history in today's lecture and for the rest of the week. But just keep in mind, when I had mentioned I don't like testing on names or dates, mostly because I can't remember them myself. But also that's something that's really easy to memorize, but it doesn't give me any understanding of your comprehension and your ability to apply. So I include names and dates because they are helpful for some, and the names are useful to set us in context, but I won't ask you questions like, give me the name of a person, or in what year did this happen? I just don't think those are fair. So our first big question, if we start an introductory psychology course, is what is psychology? And a lot of people will associate psychology with sort of characterized things. So maybe you think of a Freudian psychologist sitting in a dark room on a red armchair with someone on a couch in front of them, and they're asking them to tell them about their childhood. Maybe that's what you think of when you think of psychology. A lot of people think of something to do with the study and treatment of psychological disorders, but there's a lot more to psychology than that. And I've already kind of hinted at how diverse psychology is by talking about my own research. Because by trade, I am a psychologist, but my research isn't with humans or any kind of psychological disorder. It's actually with songbirds and how they communicate and how they learn. So something so far removed from clinical psychology still falls under that umbrella of psychology. So we're going to find, as we work through this chapter, and indeed the rest of this course, that psychology ends up being a very broad field that kind of overlaps with a lot of other areas. So in my research, I've worked with people who are pure psychologists. I've worked with people like myself who have a biology background. Maybe we have an ecology perspective. I've worked with people who do neuroscience research, and all of that classifies as psychology, which is just really cool. And so one of the most interesting things that I found about psychology is that psychology as a field is very recent. It's only in the last, say, 150, 200 years that psychology has actually been called a field. But the ideas that psychology is based on have existed for centuries. We're going to go as far back as Greek philosophers like Plato for ideas of what makes the mind the mind. So the field itself is very new, but the ideas are not. And so our most simple start to what is psychology is we can actually break down the word. So we have psyche, which is of Greek origin, and it means the soul, plus another Greek word logos, which means to study. So psychology, from its roots, is studying the soul. And there's going to be a bunch of different definitions of psychology, and different textbooks have different interpretations. But I've chosen two that I see fairly often. The first is that psychology is the scientific study of behavior and the mind. And the second one is the scientific study of conscious experience. Now, I include the second one because that's what our textbook chooses to list, but I don't like it. My issue with that definition is that by saying that it's the study of conscious experience, we're excluding anything that isn't conscious. So the things that we aren't aware of are then excluded from that definition. So things that are happening in our minds that we're not aware of doesn't count by that definition. And I don't necessarily like that exclusion. So no matter what our textbook says, I like the definition that psychology is the scientific study of behavior and the mind. And the reason I like that version is because we can talk about behavior, the physical things that we can do, the stuff that happens with our body, things that we can observe, and quantify and track as a scientist, as well as that sort of not quite quantifiable abstract concept of the mind. And we'll actually talk about that strange duality of our body and our mind and how that works together when we talk about some of the core theories in psychology. But our definition is saying that we're going to study things that people do and what's going on internally as they do them. And we have specified that it is a scientific study of those things. So our scientific approach is going to be the systemic gathering and evaluation of empirical evidence. We can break this down. We can talk about something being systemic, and it's performed according to a set of rules or conditions. So if I want to go and study the black-capped chickadees on campus, if I walk around and take pictures of every chickadee that I see, that's not really a systemic approach. But if I say that I'm going to walk from this building across campus following a particular path, and I'm going to take pictures of every chickadee that I notice on that path, and I'm going to do that every Tuesday for the rest of the semester, all of a sudden, that's a pretty good set of rules to decide how I'm going to be looking at those birds. So I've outlined a set of rules or conditions that determine how I'm going to collect my evidence. And when we talk about something being empirical, our empirical evidence, that's another really core trait of something that's scientific. And we'll talk about this more at length in Chapter 2 when we start talking about methodologies and research and things like that. But a little bit more briefly, when we say that something is empirical, we're saying that it is capable of being verified or disproven by observation or experiment. So when we talk about something scientifically, we're not necessarily able to prove that it is one particular way. Though in the media, you'll also always see cases of, new study proves X, or researchers have found Y. But in practicality, when you start doing research, you don't necessarily prove that something is true. Instead, you gather evidence that supports a particular theory. What you can do is prove that something isn't true. So you can disprove a particular view. So my example of black-capped chickadees. So maybe you have a theory that they learn to sing by listening to their neighbors. So you're going to do an experiment. You're going to systemically gather information about their singing abilities through an experiment. And so once you'll have them learn to sing next to a neighbor, and the next time you're going to remove the neighbor. Have new birds learn to sing without a neighbor. And if they learn to sing, then all of a sudden we've disproven that they need to learn from a neighbor, because they did just fine without them. But if you find that they do worse when there is no neighbor, we haven't said that it is definitely because the neighbor is there. We're giving evidence that the neighbor was probably helpful, but we don't know what specific part of that situation is what's driving the relationship we're looking at. So we will never concretely prove something in science, but we can gather more and more evidence and be more and more confident in that conclusion, but there's always some random finding, some piece of evidence that could appear that would give us evidence to the contrary, that would disprove our idea. And that quality is what makes it empirical and what makes it scientific. So there's always some way for the data to go that would show us that we were wrong. And that's kind of a cool way to frame it. I'm actually going to call it there. We'll start talking about types of research and transition into our history lesson next time. But yeah, I will see you guys on Wednesday.